but it's been thrown around a lot, is that the White House website moved to Drupal. And so for the open source community, it was kind of a shot in the arm because they were excited that a very high profile group would use an open source solution. But I always caution that this doesn't signal a change in policy, and there's still all the hard work you still have to do for being able to really get open source adopted more broadly and to make it easier to procure. There's incredible challenges, especially on the federal level in that area. These are some of the initiatives then, the sort of a spate of activity that follow people that are interested in technology, people that are interested in open government and transparency. One of the early, there's a contest called Apps for Democracy that was created by the District of Columbia. It was inspired by the Sunlight Foundation's Apps for America contest. And the idea was to incent developers, and it had to be open source contributions, to make applications that would make it easier to take data stores that were made available by government, available to people on their iPhone so they could get on, or iPhone, their mobile device. So they could pick up their mobile device and see where they're standing at that moment, how many bicycles had been stolen in the last 10 hours, or where the next bus came by. And this has become very popular in a lot of cities. The city of Portland did a similar contest, but they're learning a lot, so that was very popular. It engaged the open source community, got a lot of developers going, but they also find that it's not always easy to implement, and you can't use all of it, and you can't necessarily maintain it. And there is a real cost to free, even though folks were donating the application. So that was an early interesting project. I think we're going to see less of that. I know DC has decided to discontinue that. New York and Boston are doing them, so we'll watch and see how that works. Code for America was hatched about a year ago, and that is essentially, it's like Volunteers for America. They're internships, and they're working with private foundations to contribute to this, so they're embedding interns in cities to help them with their software projects to do primarily more open source, although obviously other skills are used because government's not monolithic and they have lots of legacy applications, so you have to talk with, systems have to talk with each other. But the people that work, the interns that are working for this group are fantastic, and I've been introducing them to people in government because this is part of the cultural gap. I'll touch on it in a minute. Civic Commons took the idea of Code for America and thought, well, what if we actually start creating stacks of applications for cities and counties? And again, this is a new project. You know, the jury is still out on how this works. There's interesting debates. Should you create a standard stack, or should you just make everything available? If there was a standard stack, who would decide which applications were picked? So this is, but this is one to watch. And then the most recent one that was introduced last year, this is fun. This was actually created by public service employees called GovHub. So they're using GitHub to do to put some government projects together. So this is my summary on what I think government needs to go forward. One is less buzz. I mean, buzz is interesting in that it gets people's attention, but it can also create an expectation that more is happening than it really is. And the people that I work with inside government have to do the grinding, boring, detailed, gritty work of grinding through policy. And so when you meet someone from government that's trying to work on this, don't confuse them with an inertia. They just really, they're there to do a job, and it's not always an easy one. I think that the more investments that are being made by government, like the HOST project, where the Department of Homeland Security has an opportunity to do that, are really important, and I appreciate that they're willing to do that. I think also we need to improve our ability to do documentation. It's kind of a weak point in the open source community. If you have, the more written case studies you have, so peers can share with each other, the easier it is for them to make a case to do that. More skilled workforce development, we've talked about that a little bit. And greater cultural exchange. There's a gap between government IT and industry sometimes, and I enjoy personally getting to close that. The folks that I work with at the state had an awareness that people had an opinion that the reason that they worked for government because it was the only job they could get. And that's kind of rough to know. No one really wants to butt up into that. That's not true for everyone, but that it's part of the gap that exists. And I think that the codathons and the hackathons and the unstructured conferences we have that employees from the state can now couldn't go to before because they didn't have agendas, that's changing too. The more people are talking to each other, the smaller that gap will get. And then we just need to let people know when they're doing a great job, because as I mentioned, most of the public service employees that are being very resourceful and using open source and sometimes taking personal risks in doing that if they're in an environment that's not used to that, just you don't know about it, you don't hear about it. So when you do, thank anyone that's working in government for the work they're doing. So there's a nutshell for you. We have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question for me or a comment? David.
Two quick comments, really, not so much questions. First of all, thank you so much. Great info. Second, you didn't mention the Department of Defense at the federal level. The DoD is actually doing quite a lot. We've got conferences and stuff like that. So I guess anybody who's interested in that stuff.
Yes, I threw out DoD as the high score. It's absolutely true. I mentioned John Scott's technology roadmap. That's an investment. They're investing in people taking the time to do policy work, and they're very forward thinking in their strategy. And they use a lot of open source. The Navy contributes to the LAMP stack. They run their battleships off of open source. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Did you have another comment?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Question.
Do you see in working with the governments any activity in educating the management level?
Okay, so the question was, do you see any activity in educating the management level? I created the Government Open Source Conference because no, there is no. In fact, I don't know that government really works on educating management level too much anyway. It's interesting. I spoke to someone from Europe once about the difference in culture, in IT culture for government, and in the U.S. and Europe. And we discovered that one of the biggest differences is that in the U.S. we really respect and appreciate an IT director, CIO level personnel for their ability to move things through the bureaucracy, their ability to work in the bureaucracy, and not so much for their IT skills. And so as a result, no one really ever thinks about educating them. I mean, seriously, that is really why I created the Government Open Source Conference we created, was not to learn how to improve your Linux implementation. It was about training and educating management personnel. And I think that is a real gap. I absolutely agree. There's not much happening. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's a focus. Yeah. And by the way, this gentleman is from the South Carolina Department of Correction. What's that? North Carolina. From the Carolinas.
Yeah, one comment.
Yes.
As you mentioned that, in your comment with kudos to the unsung heroes.
Yes.
One of the comments my wife made to me before Steve and I came down. Steve and I come with our own nickel. We don't represent North Carolina. We represent our interest in the open source community. But one of the comments my wife made before I left was, I feel like you're putting your job in jeopardy.
Yeah. So a member of our audience said that someone in their family commented she was concerned their job might be in jeopardy because they're here on their own dime and not to represent the agency they come from. And it's a tremendous challenge, especially the economy. Most state agencies and public service employees can't travel. In fact, I come from a travel restricted state, and I should say maybe this is a good time to thank the conference and the sponsors for helping people like me to be able to come and make this presentation. But that is a big detriment. I think one of the things in terms of cultural exchange, I hope that we can create better infrastructure for people to do things virtually. It is very difficult. You cannot run an open source project with never putting people in the same room. It's very hard to exchange virtually. There are limits to that. And I really appreciate you personally coming. But as we mentioned, works for a Department of Correction, but had never heard of this national corrections project. So challenge. We hope the host project can help share some of this information too. Thank you for your comments. Okay, I think we have 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any other questions, comments, contributions? Yes?
You mentioned federal or state a lot, but what about the local governments?
What about?
County, cities, those kinds of things.
County and cities? Wow, wow, I skipped a whole slide. Counties and cities. Counties are really smart. They're really resourceful. I work in a state that has lots of counties that only have a 50% CIO. In Polk County, the CIO pulled together 35 other counties, and they're doing an open source GIS project. They also are using Drupal for content management, and they went to a college to have a student help them do that. In Colorado, there's a city in Colorado that's used everything from Joomla to other wikis and things to do police bulletin boards. And so the county, when the county's folks are finding out about things, they actually have almost better latitude because they have fewer restrictions, so they can adopt open source. So you find it most typically in GIS has really become pretty hot too for the counties and cities. Any other last question? Thank you very much for coming.